Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. It's a new parliament and a new 5 years for government, but it's also a new 5 years for me, because for the first time I've stepped out from the secure environments of the Laboratory of Molecular Biology to take on a broader role. And I did so because it's a privilege and an honor, but also because it's a chance for me to repay the UK and the UK science community for having fostered and nurtured my research for so many years and contributed to my success as a scientist. It's also somewhat unlikely because I arrived here in the UK only 16 years ago, and if someone had told me when I arrived that 16 years later I would be standing here as the president-elect of the Royal Society, I would have certified them as insane. And yet here I am, and it's a testimony actually to the openness and the acceptance of Britain as a society and as a scientific community. So there are two problems with speaking last, and one is that a lot of what I wanted to say has already been said by many people and very clearly, and the other is that I realize I'm standing between you and lunch. And so I would like to touch on some of the topics that have already been spoken about, but in a personal way. And the two things I would like to talk about are the importance of supporting science, which of course you've heard a lot about, and science as an international enterprise. Now, we've all heard that science is essential for long-term growth and that it's essential for our future if we don't want to decline gradually into a sort of becoming a poor country, but want to maintain our status as an advanced society. We absolutely need to support science. And the interesting thing is that we need to have that balance between science that is recognizably of immediate benefit, such as for medicine or technology and so on, with basic science. And the reason is that if you take any technology, whether it's this plastic or this iPhone or the electricity that powers everything, if you go back to what actually made it possible, it's always some basic science discovery. You all know about Faraday's quote to William Gladstone, who asked him, "What practical use is electricity?" And he said, "In all likelihood, sir, you may be able to tax it someday." And of course, Faraday may have underestimated how much tax would come out of electricity. Okay. But an even more unlikely example is that Newton's laws of motion and several hundred years later, Einstein's theory of relativity, both the special and general theory of relativity, led to a device that can prevent you from getting lost in your car or when you're out somewhere. That's truly astonishing, and no one could have predicted that. Neither Einstein nor Newton could have predicted that. The other thing is that Britain punches well above its weight in supporting science. It has got that balance right historically between supporting basic and applied science. And as a result, it's punched well above its weight, not only per capita, but per pound of investment. And so we really should be grateful that the government last time round ring-fenced, or in nominal terms, the science budget. All scientists actually should be grateful that in a difficult time, when lots of cuts were being made, science was relatively protected. But as we've heard, inflation is eating away at that budget. And then we also have to ask, where do we stand relative to other countries? Our investment per GDP is much lower than many of our competitors. And we heard about China overtaking even those like Germany and the US. So clearly we do need over the long term to increase spending on science as a proportion of GDP, as a proportion of the budget. And what I hope for is that over the long term we commit to a larger spending on science, because we've all heard that spending on science is actually a very good return on investment. I realize it cannot be done overnight, and in fact the scientific community couldn't even absorb a large increase overnight. But if it's done gradually and in a stable way, that can help. Another reason it can help is that private investment is very closely linked to government investment. In fact, in all countries, if you track the two, they go hand in hand. And indeed, a recent example of that is when AstraZeneca had to decide where to place its research and development headquarters. They had a choice of Boston, San Francisco, or Cambridge. And the reason they chose Cambridge was the large scientific community, mostly government funded, in Cambridge, and they chose to build their research and R&D plant right next to the LMB, which is where I work. And in fact, they've already started links with the MRC and the LMB as a result of that. Finally, cutting in bad times, whether it's to reduce the deficit or because the economy is in a tailspin, it actually makes very bad economic sense. It's the equivalent of a farmer eating his seed corn. And the reason it makes bad economic sense is that it takes a lot of time, 10 to 20 years, to train a scientist. Now, if you cut your science budget, a large fraction, and it's usually the younger people on temporary jobs, in other words, the future leaders of science, who will leave science, and they will go off and do something else. Those people are not going to come back into science because they'll be out of it by the time the economy recovers. And so then you will have to spend an enormous amount training another generation of scientists. So it actually is very bad value for money to cut science in bad times. And science is such a tiny part of the budget that the money saved is simply not worth it. So the other thing that supporting science does is it sends a message to the rest of the world that Britain is a forward-looking country, that it will remain on top technologically. And that's very important, both for its reputation and for attracting investment. The second point I'd like to make is the international nature of science and how it affects policy, such as immigration. Science is an international activity. There's no question. If you go to the best institutions anywhere, Harvard, Berkeley, or indeed the place where I work, the MRC Laboratory of Molecular Biology, you will see that the people there are from all over the world, including the people in leadership positions. Several of the heads of division at the MRC LMB are from somewhere else. Many of the UK Nobel laureates, including a large proportion in this century alone, have been immigrants. And in fact, half of the 14 Nobel Prizes of the MRC Laboratory of Molecular Biology went to people who were born abroad, including the founder of the lab. And finally, half of the recent presidents of the Royal Society were actually immigrants. So that tells you that immigrants actually contribute a great deal to British society, and as a fraction of their population, they too punch above their weight, just as Britain does in the global economy. So historically, it's very clear that Britain has been very welcoming to immigrants and to international people. And we need to continue to do that because it's necessary if we're going to be able to compete with the US and other countries. When my father was a young man, it was traditional for Indians to go to the UK to be trained for higher studies. But by the time I graduated, the focus had already shifted to the US. And those sorts of things put Britain at a disadvantage. And we need to be able to recruit the best scientists and students. Now, the reason I mention this is because there is now a debate about immigration. And of course, every society, and indeed every government that represents it, has a right to decide what levels of immigration are appropriate. I certainly understand that. But in that debate, it's important to make sure that whatever policy is adopted does not affect our ability to do the best science in Britain, because that will ensure the long-term economic health of the country. Now, one of the things that Dame Jocelyn rightly pointed out is that often things like salary requirements and bank accounts are tied into visa requirements. Now, scientists are underpaid. They don't mind it sometimes. I mean, they don't mind it up to a point. As long as they can do their science and live a decent life, they're not in it for the money. And so they are actually traditionally underpaid. And so it's important to understand what the pay scales are of top scientists and top postdoctoral fellows before making these sorts of requirements which make recruiting difficult or impossible. The other thing is that procedures need to be streamlined and efficient. Now, currently, people have to jump through lots of hoops to get a visa to come and work here. Now, the thing I like to point out is that in the Soviet Union, if you wanted to buy something at the GUMs, which are the government department stores, you had to choose your thing and fill out a form. You had to take that form to a cashier, fill out another form, and then get a receipt. And then you had to take that third form to someone else who would then give you the product. Not surprisingly, after liberalization, there are no GUMs left in the Eastern Bloc because you can go to any store like John Lewis and simply plunk down your money or your credit card and buy it. Okay. Now, visa problems are exactly the same sort of thing. If you're a student or a young scientist and you have a choice of some of the best places, where would you go to a place that seems to be welcoming because you simply fill out a thing and then it's evaluated and you get your visa, or whether you have to jump through hoops? So, and expediency is also important. It's not reasonable to ask them to wait several months before things are decided, because they will simply go somewhere else. And we need to encourage the best students and so on. So all of this has been about details of policy and figures and so on. And this reminds me of Oscar Wilde's quote about knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing. So I'd like to ask you to take a step back and say, supposing you were to go 200 years back with the knowledge you have now, and tell people that you knew what was the basis, the molecular basis of how people inherit genetic characteristics, or that we knew things about the origins of the universe, or that we had things called antibiotics which could help cure infections, or that we had computers, we had technology that would allow you to talk to your grandson in New York, not just talk to them, but actually see them, hundreds of miles away, thousands of miles away. Everyone, even the smartest people in the 18th century, like Samuel Johnson or Voltaire, would have thought that we were magicians. That's what science has done over the last 200 years. And the interesting thing is that Britain has played a major role in every one of those major advances, whether it's to do with genetics and molecular biology, or whether it's to do with the World Wide Web, or other sorts of technology. And we should be as proud of it as we are of Shakespeare and the Magna Carta, because it's as much a part of that culture. Another thing is that modern science, the idea that it's evidence-based and authority doesn't count, that idea really was promoted by the Royal Society in its inception. And that way of doing science predates the Industrial Revolution and indeed may have accelerated it. And that too is a particularly British contribution to science. And we continue, despite whatever problems we may have, to be a beacon to people from all over the world. I myself took a 40% pay cut to come here because of the stability of funding and the environment at the L&B. So it's a tradition we should be proud of, and it's part of what makes Britain great and increases our global influence. And we're the inheritors and the guardians of that legacy. So let's not forget that that's our role to nurture in the debate about how important science is. Thank you.